Good morning, church. And thank you, James, for that reading. And the songs were fantastic. Prayer was great. Sid did bring up great points in the Lord's Supper. Questions that you've never heard a congregation ask. You hear what the first one he said was? 20 more minutes. What a curious time we find ourselves this morning. I don't hear anyone asking, so... Anyway, good to see you here today and glad you could be with us. We do know we have some visitors and people that haven't been here before, and we're thrilled that you could be here. We want you to know you are welcome, very, very welcome here. And we pray that we are as hospitable as can be. And this is a place where you can truly see God being worshiped in spirit and in truth. And again, we're thankful that you are here. We've been on a series that we're going to get to in just a moment and finding what it means for Jesus to be first in our lives. But got three things I want to start out with first. First of all, thank you for all the people that have been in. We had a request for golf clubs and golf paraphernalia to benefit a program that started in Illinois. And you've been so generous in that. Really, a lot of texts and a lot of things are gathered. And I plan to take initial amount this week over there to help them start a middle school golf program. So thank you very, very much for your generosity in that regard. That's been fantastic and deeply appreciated, very much so. Second of all, a thing that was a blessing to me this morning and maybe to you, Daniel Daup was a member here. He now preaches at Hallsville Church of Christ and work with them. He started a podcast, and the whole point of the podcast is for you to be encouraged Sunday morning. And it's for your Sunday morning drive. And it's 4 or 5 minutes. And he's only got 2 episodes, and they've been fantastic. Typically, when you start with a podcast or some sort of media like that, they say you really find your flow after about 100 episodes. He's off to a really strong start with 2. So I can't wait to hear what the 100th is like. And if you have a moment, that may be something that you benefit from as well. I love just giving encouragement and finding good tools for our congregation, but also the hard work that a lot of people are putting in. So we appreciate what Daniel's doing. Third bit, really good news before we get started. We have some new members of our congregation. You may have met them, and they've been coming for some time, but they've met with the elders, and they said they want to be members here and part of our church family, and we are thrilled about that. So right now, I want to ask Karen Isham if she'll stand up. And Karen, where are you at? There we go. And then Gail and Blake McDonald, if you will also stand up. There's Gail and Blake also. And we want to welcome you all into our church family. I mean, really, it's a fantastic thing to be able to worship with you and to have you be a part of our congregation here. Thank you very much. Looking forward to growing together. All right, let's jump into it. That's 3 good positive things. Let's just keep it rolling. Today, we're going to talk about our intersection between justice and purpose. Over the last 15 lessons that we've had, we've really been finding out Jesus first in our lives. And what does that mean in a sense of how we belong, to who we belong to where do we belong. Also a sense of our identity. What does it mean to be people of God, to be Jesus' people? Who are we because of Jesus? And we've been recently focusing on our purpose because of that. Now, typically, your sense of belonging, your identity, and your purpose, that really sort of encapsulates what meaningfulness will mean in life, but especially in Christianity. And now we are closing in. Last week, we dealt with our passions and our purposes, and that was very personal, but there's an action to this. There's a framework within this that we kind of really need to sit in to make the most of it. God expects all of us to be active. God wants every single one of us to know that we do have purpose in Him, and it must begin with Him. That passage that James read to us just a second ago is from Psalm 33, and in Psalm 33, it's really a song about the praise of God for creation. And there's these really powerful things that he says in there. If you want to turn over there for just a second, we'll sit in that for just a moment, Psalm 33. Because it really provides a good foundation from where we start. And that's the important thing we have to remember when it comes to justice and purpose. Where do we begin? From where does that come out of? So we know that we're starting in the right place and we're moving in the right direction. It must be defined by God. Well, with regard to justice, Psalms 33 kind of gives us a hint of the scope of that. That this is the normal way that God expects things to be. We sometimes corrupt that, but this is how God intended things to be. And so that's got to be where we start. God's intentions, the Creator's intentions. Psalm 33 really is about creation, and verses 4 through 9 dial in really specific on the fact that the Word spoke creation into being. In the ancient Near East, there was an idea of that if you would name a thing, if you could speak it, you would give it sort of a thrust and power. This goes to an even higher scope of that God brought into being what was not before simply because He willed it and He spoke it. The psalmist is encouraging people to praise God in Psalm 33 because of that, and he gives them these really interesting instructions. I find it interesting because we don't know what the Psalms actually sound like. They didn't come with a series of chord progressions and time signatures. We don't know a whole lot of details. This one's interesting because it does emphasize two specific instruments, the lyre and the 10-string harp. And it does give a sense of the attitude that it was to be sung. If you look at verse 3, sing to Him a new song, play skillfully with a shout of joy. Isn't that interesting? However you picture the Hebrew people worshiping God, sometimes we'll see it in the movies as sort of a droning, dry thing where they strip life out of it. He is telling them to sing it with a shout of joy. Don't restrain your joy. Get it out there. You're praising God. And why? Well, because of the Word. Because of the Word in creation. And in that is the foundation for which we get these really big concepts that we'll talk about in our purpose. Look at verse 4. For the word of the Lord is right, and all His works are done in truth. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of His mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of Him. For He spoke, and it was done. And He commanded, and it stood fast. Literally above everything is God. God reigns supreme in initiating creation and therefore determining what it should be by His will, but also setting the standard by which all things should compare themselves and the foundation from which we must begin. And we get that. The word of the Lord is right. There is a rightness in what God has done. So there should be a rightness in what we do. All His work is done in truth. There is truth initiated from God. So truth should be a foundation from which we do the acts that we do and we find our purposes. In verse 5, He loves righteousness and justice, which will be our emphasis for today. But that stems from the beginning. From the beginning, there was a sense of righteousness and justice emanating from God, the Creator, into creation and what it should be. What it should be. The earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. Now, I know I'm saying these things. You're like, Bible, 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 Bible. But if we look out into the world, isn't there a lot of evil out there? In fact, if we were to go to city to city to city to city to city to city, to country to city, wherever, wouldn't we expect to see a great deal of evil? Wouldn't we expect to see injustice? Wouldn't we expect that? Maybe. It would be naive to think we wouldn't encounter it. But is that where it should begin? Is that what normal because we allow it to become normal, because we accept it, because we sit in it and we say, I guess there's nothing we can do? Or do we begin where God begins and say, truth, righteousness, love, justice, the things of God, this ought to be the normal? And as God's people, should we not participate in a way that stands for, stands up, and acts in a way that harmonizes with that normal that God initiated? It's two different approaches to life. That's two different approaches to the way that we find purpose in following God and praising God. And the psalmist makes it clear that that ideology that we begin with creation and from what comes out of it to define life for us, we should sing that with a shout of joy. And so, when we look at purpose and Jesus first, with a shout of joy, perhaps we should consider justice. Justice in the world. Creation's really interesting though, isn't it? Man's created very uniquely in creation because we alone are created in God's image, Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27. We alone have the capability in creation to discern right and wrong, to understand God in a personal way. We can respond to Him either faithfully and obediently and submit to Him, or we may reject Him. We alone were created in that way. But from nature, we find things that we can kind of see and understand structures and things. If we project them on humans, we might have a different opinion. You ever consider the bees? There's a symbiotic relationship that exists between bees. I love these images. They slowed this bee 1,000 frames, slowed it down. We have a bee in a very normal symbiotic relationship with the plant. They mutually benefit from this. The bee will land on there and get pollen on its legs, and it will carry that off, and it will help the plants reproduce. It's normal. But the pollen mixed with water creates nectar, which benefits the bee. It's a beneficial relationship. If we take that, we project that onto a human relationship and an interaction where both benefit, mutually construct, we say, well, man, that's really good. People are helping each other out. They both benefit. They're making choices, things humans uniquely do, and that would be great. But it's not the case with all bees, is it? It's nature, so it's really not an injustice until we project it onto humans. We'll do that in just a second. You ever heard of the cuckoo bee? It's an odd-looking bee. I mean, actually, that looks like quite an interesting thing. This is the neon cuckoo bee, and they have a variety of colors that are pretty interesting. But this bee in particular, we've now moved outside of the natural state of mutually beneficial. This thing, from a human perspective, is a tyrant. It's frankly evil. This thing would be on Dateline. You would be watching your true crime podcast every week with this one going, have you heard about the cuckoo bee? If we project it on humans. It does not build its own nests. In fact, it looks kind of like the cuckoo bird for the nest of somebody else. So it's taking advantage of somebody else's hard work. It does not lay its eggs in its own nest because it lays its eggs in other bees' nests. Like, what? Puff up a little bit, bee. I will crush you for that. Not only does it lay its eggs in that other nest, but its eggs typically, in certain species, will hatch first. And when they do, they then consume the resources that were intended for the original bee's little babies. I'll now use human terms to make it sound even worse. And then even worse, those babies that hatch first and eat the food of the original babies, then turn and look at the original babies, and then still hungry, you fill it in on your various podcasts and whatever. It's bad, man. It's bad. Can you imagine if we put that in humans' terms? We would be so riled up. We would beg for the justice in this. We would call for it to fall down. Or we would sit and watch and go like, man, I'm glad that's not happening to me, and turn to the next episode. As Christians, what do we do with justice and injustice in the world? How does being God's people create a framework for us to know how to act and find purpose in the world with regard to those things that came out of God in creation, truth and righteousness and justice and goodness? How do we respond to God in that regard? And how do we respond to our fellow man with regard to justice? How do we right wrongs in a godly way? Well, Jesus was very instructive in that regard. Go over to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, he's going to give a story that you may be very familiar with, and I think there's a lot of benefit in this particular account that Jesus gives. We call it the Good Samaritan. The interesting thing about the Good Samaritan, and at the very beginning of it, sort of the story within the story, is the way it's being presented and the reason Jesus gives it. There is a figure who is asking Jesus a question, and he's not doing it for the sake of truth or righteousness or love or kindness. He's doing it to create a situation where he can give cause against Jesus. Okay? Now think about that in the story within the story. This is a man who is determined to speak against Jesus, who we know is the Christ, who is the Son of God, who is the Creator from which truth and love and kindness and justice comes from, the very being from whom these things are defined and come from, we have a figure who's daring to question and find cause against him. That's an injustice in and of itself. And so in that moment of injustice, we find Jesus, the God of justice, giving a teachable occasion, giving a moment where this guy could maybe come to a new kind of understanding, therefore righting the wrong in his intention. It's a very generous thing that Jesus is doing here. But notice that Jesus is being active, sort of the story behind this story. Jesus is very generous in giving him this moment to come to some level of truth. What he does with it is on him. What we do with it is on us. But I want to understand what God expects for us in justice. Here we go, verse 25. Behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Well, this was not an uncommon question. The Matthew 22 passage of it gives it down to, which is the greatest of the laws. And it was a common question because sometimes they would get in these large arguments about what's the heavy law, more important law. What's the light law, the less important law? And he's trying to get him, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, wisely, what is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Then Jesus said this, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, because elevation-wise, Jerusalem was much higher than Jericho. So a man's going from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And he fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, he came and he looked, and he passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, he came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him, and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, and he brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and he said to him, Take care of him. And whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. So, which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? Verse 37, and he said, He who showed mercy on him. And Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise. Fascinating. Stories within stories, teachings within teachings. This is a heavy thing. We teach this at a very young age, pretty common, and we absolutely should. We must give consideration for the people around us. We must. We must not hesitate to be involved with life as it unfolds and the needs of others. We have purpose as godly people in doing so. But as we grow and as we mature, sort of the scope of that and the realization of our capabilities and limitations and how we redirect and rethink that starts to grow as well. Our passions for that and our purpose as the church and as God's people grows as well. But to be sure, there's temptations that would lead us to behave much like the priest and the Levite. A lot in this, for sure. When Jesus and the lawyer are talking, there's several characters that point out in this. We've got the thieves. They were active pretty quick and left. We've got the traveler simply going down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Then we have a priest, a Levite, a Samaritan, and an innkeeper. The 3 that we'll separate first are notable because these are people that were contributors of injustice. Contributors of injustice. You have Jesus describing people that are very far from God in their actions. We say, well, obviously the thieves, right? Obviously the thieves. They've done this horrendous thing on the road to Jericho, in which they have attacked a man who was guilty of nothing. They took what did not belong to them. They beat him down. They left him half dead. Cruel, not caring, antithesis of what a godly person would do. So that should have no part in our lives. That should have no part in our expectations of how life should be. It's so counter to God. It's horrendous. It's horrendous. Sometimes we say, but that's just the way life is. Is it? If we let it, maybe. The priest and the Levite, much more passive, but still contributors to injustice. The priest, unique responsibilities, very unique in the care and the love and the connection between God and people. And when he sees a man who is suffering, a man who cannot do on his own, a man who has been treated unjustly, he decides to pass on the other side. Now we say, but, maybe he was busy. Maybe he didn't want to become unclean. Maybe, and we can go through all the excuses that may exist there, but definitely he did not love that man in a way that God would call us to love someone. The Levite, second one, passing by. We don't know the time period between the two. Maybe the Levite saw the priest, maybe. Or maybe he, again, showed apathy, a lack of care. Maybe he thought, that's for somebody else to deal with. And in that way, he allowed injustice to take root and find place, and the thieves to believe we can keep carrying on. But at some point, that cannot be allowed. Certainly not by God's people. We have a man who is suffering. We have cruelty that's unfolding. We have a road that is now not a safe place. And Jesus' point here is, what will you do? So he uses the idea of the Samaritan who comes along. And between the traveler, the Samaritan, and the innkeeper, we now have people who are contributors of justice. And this is what godly people ought to be, contributors of justice. The traveler simply doing what normal people should be able to do quite freely and safely, travel from one place to the other without fear, without condemnation, and to know no matter where they come from or where they're going, it should be safe. Okay, so he takes advantage of that natural right, the way things ought to be. The Samaritan, and of course we know the disputes between the Samaritans and the Jewish people, and so Jesus is making a point here that this guy that the Jewish people would have thought was lowly and incapable of great moral works was doing this amazing thing that should be noted as the example for them to follow and certainly for us to follow. The Samaritan was moved with compassion. He begins with a godly trait, to care about life, to put a priority on it, and to see that if there's a person that has been treated in such an unjust manner, that he, with whatever means he has, should get involved. The excuses didn't set in his heart. And if they were triggering in the back of his mind somewhere, or some voice like, man, you've got so many things to do. Man, this could be a trap. Set it aside for the greater good. In the scope of the capability that he had, he let his compassion and his godliness direct his steps to do something for justice, to right something that was wrong. You say, well, I get that, but maybe thieves are still out there. No, this isn't vigilante. He's not Batman. I guess that's maybe what some people, he should chase down the thieves. Not as a man is dying. Priorities. And maybe he didn't have that capability. Priest probably had some influence there to get people out there and do something about the road, probably. But this man is taking care of what's in front of him and what he has capability. He's not going to let this guy die. So he puts him on his animal. He takes him to the inn. He dresses the wounds, and he takes him to the inn, and he spends his money to care for the guy. In fact, he gives extra. And I find what's interesting is he invites the innkeeper to participate in the justice. It's not just a business transaction. He's inviting him to care, to be involved, and to establish justice in that area. Right something that's wrong. And if he needs anything else, the Samaritan will come back and he will make that right as well. More justice, more good, more mercy, more compassion. He's going above But shouldn't this be the normal? If we're coming out of a place of truth and righteousness, love and compassion, the way that God intended things, Jesus has given this teaching, which was going to be quite striking to people because they didn't allow it to become their normal. But then he ends in this really powerful way when he asks him, to who was he neighbor? And he said, the one that showed mercy. And then Jesus gives this one line that is very, very special here. I think my battery's dead here, so we're going to move on. Chris, will you go to the next slide? He says this, go and do likewise. This is not just an intellectual exercise for the people that were involved at the time that Jesus was talking to. It's not an intellectual exercise for us to go, that's a nice story. I'm glad that unfolded this way. It's instructive. It's an example of how we need to be. Go and do likewise. Jesus is telling us that our purpose, one of our purposes as Christians, based on our passions, is to go and do likewise, to establish truth and righteousness and justice in the world. If there is a wrong, then we need to participate in bringing a right to the best of our capabilities. And in that, we will glorify God. Chris, we go to the next slide. For the word of the Lord is right, and all his work is done in truth. Verse 5. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the goodness of the Lord. Do we believe that? Do we want that to be true? Do we accept that we have a responsibility in that, a purpose in that, to carry that into the world, and that we can be involved and make a difference in the midst of this? Truly, we need that in our world. God does not call us to be passive people, to let the world and the works that go in it go by however they choose, and we huddle in a bubble and are too scared to go out, or we got too many excuses to be involved. No, he's calling us to be involved and to move with compassion, to be caring for people, to get our hands dirty and bandaging wounds, to lift people up and take them where they need to go for healing. And if it costs us, if there's some sacrifice involved, we're going to do it. Because that's the way of God. It's exactly the kind of person Jesus was an example for us to doing. He's not calling us to do anything out of the ordinary. In fact, this ought to be the normal. It ought to be the normal. That's his instructions, Chris. So what does that look like today? Chris, next slide. Put this picture up because I thought, man, that's sort of an idyllic thing. Very peaceful, isn't it? Like on a day like today, we're so beautiful outside. Wouldn't it be great to sit on that bench, read a book, chat with friends? It just looks so nice. It got me thinking, peace, it doesn't exist unless there's justice, is there? Peace doesn't exist unless there's some bit of justice. That row, whoever made it, either thieves made that bench and put them there, or a really safe person. The back is to the road, so you don't know who's coming at you. Clever move, thieves. We'll sneak up on you. Or someone who knows that this is a safe place. I love that. Yesterday I went downtown and started looking in our community. I know not all of us go downtown all the time, but you would think, is it safe? Do we not feel blessed because of the peace we have? Yeah, I know there's bad things that take place, and you could scroll through and show me all the things that went bad this weekend and in recent years. Yeah, that's true. But also, we're pretty blessed. We walked around on a pleasant day downtown, saw some beautiful flowers that were downtown next to the museum. It's like, man, that's kind of nice. Let me walk up the road a little bit more. Got up on top of the Arts Council, and all these people were gathered outside, kind of celebrating that they were having this art show. Went in, talked to a few people. Everyone was very friendly. Walked out and saw some other people in the community, and it was very, very diverse and awesome. I even saw some young girls that were wearing shirts like 1980s punk rock clothes, checkerboard stuff, and I was like, that's fun that that's come back. And then there was these other people just walking, a guy in a fedora, older guy, not like a hipster, and he and his wife were just kind of holding hands and walking. I was like, that's really nice as well. Sat down and ate a sandwich from Jimmy John's. Wind was blowing a little bit, but people were just pleasant. It was a nice day. Peace. Felt safe. Went down the road a little bit more. The monster truck thing was happening. And even at the monster truck event, not my scene, all these little kids with big earphones over them and stuff. I was like, man, these people are having a good time. Across the road, there was a guy selling flags, had guns all over him. Still, very safe. Maybe more safe, right? Maybe. I thought, man, we've got a good thing going here. Chris, next slide. But even this stat, which I'd never noticed this before down next to the river, but even this scene of where two people are about to shake hands in a sign of unity, in a sign of we gather together, there's a sense of peace and justice, and that we're all in this. We all need to be a part of this. And if good people, godly people, are going to be active, the likelihood of evil to rise up, injustices to occur, will diminish greatly. But if we're the kind of people that think that's someone else's job to do, or the kind of people who listen to those excuses rise up and we give them greater and greater voice that limits our participation, then yeah, darker things will rise. But what needs to rise in our mind when that happens is the things that Jesus would say. He is the God of justice. He is the creator God that set in motion the way things ought to be and give us the responsibility to maintain that as best we can. In the Sermon on the Mount, great sermon that Jesus gave, this instructive teaching, he challenges us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. Not a complicated verse, but I want you to think about this in terms of justice. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Let your light so shine before men. If there is an injustice or the effects of an injustice in your realm, your social sphere, people you encounter, let your light so shine before men, not for your glory, but that they can see God. That they can see that life ought to be another way, and it is another way, and that there are godly people willing to make a difference. That we are not the kind of people who set aside, go about our business and say, that's for you to worry about. We are engaged. We are engaged. And you say, well, I don't know, man. I don't really encounter people that get mugged a lot, and I don't encounter those situations a tremendous amount, but we do encounter things that are not right happening all the time. Some are very small, seemingly, and some are very big. Now, as an outside person, your view of that may be different than the person who's feeling the effect of that injustice. It may be very big to somebody. But they happen, Chris. Even in our own community. If you saw someone breaking in someone else's house, you're going to speak up. If that's your neighbor, you're going to speak up. It's not my business. I don't want to get involved. What if they hear me? It doesn't mean you go confront them yourselves. That may not be in your capability. It may be a very unwise choice, but you can call the police. You can let your neighbor know to keep them safe. They may not know someone's coming in their house, but you can do something. Do not be the priest. Do not be the Levite. And let somebody else take care of it. What if you know someone who's going through a tremendous amount of abuse? What if you know someone that is going through a tremendous amount of suffering? And what if you know the significant other who's causing the abuse and you're like, it's not my business. I don't want to get involved. And yet you know the suffering's taking place. How can we be complacent? It doesn't mean we go act in an ungodly way because our basis is God. So our actions and our choices and our emotions and all that needs to be in the framework of godliness and righteousness and truth. But that means we need to take action that is right and true and good and loving and compassionate. We can't let it just happen. What if you see someone that's being attacked? And you're like, man, I don't fight. Is that the only solution? Because Jesus isn't calling us to violence in and of itself. But maybe we get the right people involved in the situation. Because it may not be our fists that are hitting someone, but if we walk by, to what degree are we accepting the responsibility for letting that happen? That's a tough call. But no, it's not. It's a pretty easy call from the mouth of Jesus. Go and do likewise. Be compassionate. Have great care. Do what you can within the scope of your ability for what God would call us to do. That is your purpose, Christian. Next slide. we always are going to ask ourselves, who will I be? Will I be the thief? I certainly hope not. At some point, you're going to be the traveler. Will you be the priest? I hope not. The Levite? I certainly hope not. But the Samaritan? The innkeeper? Yes, because that's who God's asking us to be. I want that peaceful place, and I want that peaceful kind of life. The expectation should be normal. Shouldn't have to think about it. Who in the world wants to go out into a park and be looking over their shoulder all the time? Man, they're going to get me. I don't usually think that way. I don't want to. One, I don't necessarily put myself in those places, but if I find myself in those places, I am going to act godly and righteously in the framework that He wanted and introduce that characteristic. If it's absent, let your light so shine before men so they may glorify your Father who is in heaven. That is their ambition with that. Go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. It's not the only passage where Jesus calls us to do things. James 4:17 strikes me really hard. We'll close out here with that one. Therefore, to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Man, that's a wild one. That right there tells us we can't be passive people. Even though we may have all the reasons we can come up with, James 4:17 says, nope, Christian, your purpose is for justice and love and truth. Your purpose is to have a place in the world to the best of the abilities that God has given you. You may say, I don't have all the abilities that the Samaritan had. Nope, you may not. You may have more. You may have less. But whatever God's given you, use it. Use it. It could be that you know someone who's going through one of those internet scams. You're very skilled in that regard and know what to avoid, and you simply share that information with them. You may have that ability. Use it. Use it. Protect people. You may know someone that's going through a very difficult time where they're being taken advantage of, exploited. You can do something, even just to comfort them and give them a bit of wisdom and help them navigate it, because maybe you've been through it too. Do something. Do something. You may know of a business or something locally. I'm not thinking of one that comes to mind. Do not worry. Well, you know they're exploiting their workers, taking advantage of them, treating them horribly. You can say, not my business. Man, I just want to eat the spaghetti. It's so good. But should we? Maybe we need to do something a little bit more for the sake of justice, for the sake of compassion, for the sake of the way things ought to be. It's not enough just to say I'm against evil things. We need to be opposed to them and active in a godly way. That is our purpose as Christians. It's one of many, but we can't excuse that one. It's not just all, man, let's all sing our songs together and we huddle together. We got to go out sometimes and stand up for people who can't. Just like Jesus. Just like Jesus. Today we'll close out with an invitation. We have a lot of purposes in life, and this is one of many, but the most important is your relationship with God. What is right? What is true? What is very, very good according to His law and His command? And in terms of the idea of righting wrongs, is Jesus not the greatest of that? Willing to die on the cross so that our sins may be forgiven. We've talked in weeks and weeks about how much God wants you to be with Him in heaven, and He's the one that is making that possible. As humans, we get to respond, to react, to obey. If you are carrying the burden of sins, you don't have to. Jesus can wash those away, and He wants to. Today, if you think your life is so caught up into darkness and there's absolutely no way out of it, you need to know that this is not the case. There is freedom in Jesus. There is freedom in truth. There is love in the gospel. And if there's a way that we can help you with that, and if there's a way we can lift you up, if there's a way we can help you become a child of God, to have belonging and identity and purpose, and to know that it's true and it's real, we would so love to do that. If there's a way we can be there for you, let us know as we stand and as we sing.